Good morning. My name is Mari Kirk. I'm the Director of Communications and Stakeholder Engagement here with the United States Study Center. Thank you so much for joining us today for this very timely and relevant webinar. Is Russia's invasion of Ukraine a turning point for all US allies or just NATO? Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia. The University of Sydney stands on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are and pay respects to their elders past, present, and future. We are witnessing the largest ground war in Europe since the Second World War, a full-blown invasion and attack from one of the world's nuclear superpowers with a much smaller former territory. The crisis in Ukraine is escalating almost by the minute, it seems. The pictures and stories of civilians caught in the fray is juxtaposed with a leader on the streets and citizens from all walks of life enlisting to resist in any way they can. We want to cover a wide range of topics today that tap into the unique insights of our exemplary guests. We have U.S. Studies Center non-resident senior fellow Stephen Loosley. Stephen grew up with Cold War dominating his personal and political life, including serving in Parliament during the critical Hawke and Keating eras. Joining him today is Dr. Gorana Grgic, senior lecturer in U.S. politics and foreign policy. Gorana was born in the final stages of the Cold War, lived in the middle of the last major European conflict, is now working with NATO and joining us today from Europe. We're going to hear remarks from both panelists at the beginning and then have a discussion around some of the issues where Stephen and Gorana bring unparalleled expertise. Then I want to have as much time as possible for questions from the audience. Thank you to those of you who've already submitted questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the little question box you'll have in your browser. During the discussion, we're going to try to address as many of those as possible. Stephen, I'd like to hear from you first. Can you give us a bit of historical context and your reactions to what we're seeing unfold in Europe?
Thanks, Mari, and good morning to Gorana in Zagreb. I think the best way to introduce this topic is to refer to the fourth act of Shakespeare's Scottish play, where one of the sisters says, and I'm quoting, "By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes." And that's the way Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been seen in the West, indeed, around much of the world. The first casualty of this war, and it is a war, of course, we'll come to why Putin will not term it a war in a little bit of time. The first casualty of this war is not truth. Truth disappeared in Putin's Russia some time ago, and elsewhere, of course, in places like Belarus. The first casualty of this war is naivety on the part of the West, and some European powers in particular. We had in the back of our consciousness the simple conclusion that a European land war could not occur again, that the ashes of 1945 made it certain that we would not see a repetition. Of course, that's wrong. And the notion that international disputes can be solved by treaties and protocols and by strategic dialogue really has been shattered by Putin's application of massive force, of this destructive barbarism that he's unleashed upon the Ukrainian society. Now, that's having an impact in the United States, beyond doubt. Look at the response of the Biden administration and the active diplomacy of Secretary Blinken, even in Moldova just recently. The mobilization of Nato has been impressive. There's no question about that. I doubt it could have occurred under the Trump administration. It certainly has occurred under the Biden administration, and I think probably put best by Chancellor Scholz of Germany in his recent speech to the Bundestag, which I recommend to people, where essentially says, look, we are in a new reality, and the new reality is caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the German centre-left government moves from its traditional position almost of pacifism to be an active military support for Ukraine, and for a massive increase in the German defence budget. NATO has responded. Other countries, including Australia, have responded. And it's interesting that in every crisis, it seems that humanity is able to throw up. Someone rises to the occasion, and President Zelensky appears to be that person. He's speaking to the British Parliament the next 24 hours, just as he's spoken to the United States Congress, and he really has rallied opinion. Not since 1945 have we seen a conflict of this order. And there's a very good reason for that. For the whole of the First Cold War, there was that balance of mutual assured destruction. Putin has shattered that by deploying conventional arms, threatening the use of nuclear weapons, to be certain, but deploying conventional arms. And in that circumstance, Putin made a massive miscalculation. It's even possible that, as with most dictators, he believed his own propaganda machine about what was happening in Donetsk and Luhansk. He underestimated the resistance of the Ukrainian armed forces and of the various militias which have been established. The fierceness of the defences surprised the Russian military, to the extent that some reports have it that 3 Russian generals have been killed in the front line. They've certainly taken far more casualties than they envisaged. The Russians thought it would be like Crimea and the Ukrainian military would melt away. But that hasn't happened. Putin underestimated the resolve of the West, dismissed Biden, dismissed Boris Johnson and other Western leaders, thought NATO was a vehicle that was rusty and unable to respond. He's pushed Western countries into a much more determined profile opposing aggression. I mean, the reality is there's talk of Sweden and Finland joining NATO. That would simply be a de jure step. De facto, Sweden and Finland have been members of NATO for some time. They exchange intelligence. The Swedes and the Finns attend NATO strategy gatherings. Both countries have contributed weapons to the Ukrainian defense. So Putin has managed to do this. And no matter how many threats he issues, that's not going to change. I mean, for heaven's sake, he's almost caused the Swiss to abandon their neutrality of a century or more. That is a singular disaster for Russian diplomacy. And of course, the sanctions, financial, economic, and otherwise, trade and investment will really cause the Russian economy massive damage. In the London financial markets, they are already rating Russia as being bankrupt. As to what happens next, I fear we're going to see a repeat of what happened in Grozny and Chechnya, what happened in Aleppo and Homs in Syria. The Russian military have a history of flattening entire communities that offer resistance, regardless of the civilian casualties. This is simple reality. Putin is committing mercenaries from the Wagner Group or one of those other bodies that allow the Kremlin to disavow whatever they do. So I expect what is an horrific scene on the battlefield and elsewhere is about to become worse. How do I arrive at that conclusion? I just come back to someone who understood the Russian character a little better than most of us. I'm thinking of Alexander Pushkin and Eugene Onegin, where he made the observation, culture is a despot and will prevail. The Russian military culture is in full play at the moment, and unfortunately we're already seeing the results of that in civilian casualties and in devastation. I'll leave it there, Murray, and look forward to Gorana's remarks.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, and Gorana, you're in Europe right now. You lived in Europe during the last major conflict. What do you think we should know in Australia and around the world about the events that are unfolding in Ukraine?
Thank you, Mari, and thanks, Stephen. It's always a hard act to follow Stephen's references to great literature. I might start with a more prosaic quote from Comrade Lenin, who once said that there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And what we can see in now what is 11th day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is just, first of all, an immense humanitarian tragedy, tragedy for all of the people who find themselves in Ukraine, especially after what Europe has said should not ever happen on its soil. And as you said, Mari, I was there in the 90s. But I would first, before we get to actually the kind of impact of February 24th, which will certainly be remembered as a critical juncture in terms of European security and I think much more beyond that, is to actually think about the sort of impacts that we are already seeing on the ground that have been produced over the past couple of days and the past week, in terms of some of these bells that have been rung, and I think that will be very hard to unring. But equally, to understand that we find ourselves in the middle of what Clausewitz called the fog of war, and that there are equally a lot of uncertainties. And I urge everyone to just approach analysis of what's going on with utmost humility and with understanding that we are all consuming information that has been mediated, either, if you're getting it through the kind of traditional media, or if you are even sourcing it from different intelligence reports, it's still a digest and we are not on the ground. So 3 points around the immediate impact around those areas that I study, EU, NATO, US. So in terms of EU's response and the impact that February 24th has had, we can say that while Putin's plans of a blitzkrieg haven't necessarily materialized, what they have done in just a span of a couple of days is
I think you might have frozen, Gorana. Okay, we'll come back to you in just a minute. Hopefully your internet will come good. Stephen, I just want to turn to you quickly. And, everything we are seeing is coming through different media filters. I guess, is there anything that you think about the media commentary that we might be missing as to why we now find ourselves embroiled in this ground war in Europe?
I don't think we've looked at the historic circumstances carefully enough. I think the suggestion that Putin is endeavoring to recreate the Soviet Union is an utter nonsense. The oligarchs which surround him have done very well in his system. What he's about doing is endeavoring to recreate the Russian Empire. And he sees himself as a modern Tsar, perhaps like Tsar Alexander III, who built his regime, very, very reactionary regime, on the Orthodox Church, on autocracy, and on a vigorous Russian nationalism. And to that extent, Putin looks back, perhaps as far as Peter the Great and the Battle of Poltava, in establishing again Russia as a serious international player, as a global player. Putin was really stung by Barack Obama's dismissal of Russia as a regional power. He saw the breakup of the Soviet Union as a catastrophe, and part of that was the fact that there was no longer an alternative, a great power, an alternative weight to the US and its allies. So he sees the resumption of Russian control of Ukraine, and that's what we're talking about here, the resumption of Russian control of Ukraine in the same way it controls Belarus, as being important to Russian nationalism. And I don't think we've seen enough of that covered, and I'd like to see more of it. That would take us to the war in Georgia, to Crimea, and eventually to the war in Ukraine. I think we've got Gorana back, so I'll leave it at that.
Yes, we do. Glad to have you back, Gorana. If you want to, pick up on the points you were walking through, Stephen was just talking about some of the broader implications for Australia, but anything else you think we need to know?
Yeah, it's just the nature of Zooms and failures of technology when you least want them. On the EU side, as I said already, we are seeing a major shift in terms of European Union's self-identification, basically going much further than what has traditionally been EU's sort of thinking about its role in the world as either a normative or economic power, and now going much, much further than what was even, the response to the annexation of Crimea and the first years of the war in Ukraine that obviously has been going on for 8 years now. On the NATO side, I think we can't stress enough how much this has impacted the kind of core task of NATO, and that is collective defense and deterrence. So a lot of NATO's work over the past couple of decades has been actually more about either the sort of cooperative security or crisis management, out of area operations. This basically again stresses the importance of looking onto what has been basically the core mission. And again, this was something that was already put as an imperative in the wake of 2014, that is, but now has been stressed even to a greater extent. And then in terms of the United States, I think what has been really interesting to observe when it comes to the Biden administration's response is that US is trying to balance between having a sort of leading, coordinating role, I would say. It's really interesting if you take a look at President Biden's State of the Union speech from last week, where he did stress how the administration was in contact with its allies in imposing the sanctions, in basically mounting this sort of unified front. But at the same time, it has been doing things to signal much beyond what is happening in Europe, that it's not losing sight of what is the core of US grand strategy and its assessment of the world in the long term. And, if you think about the fact that in February, US published its Indo-Pacific strategy, that there have been some very prominent visits in the Indo-Pacific region over the past couple of weeks, even while the security crisis was escalating in Ukraine, tells us a lot also about where the US ultimately wants to be, and that even though priorities are being shifted, that the strategic calculus isn't necessarily changed. But what I hope we'll get to in a little bit is how actually the response to what is going on will also be determined by those competitors and rival powers. So finally, one very last thing in terms of then the more long-reaching impacts, we could distinguish between the sort of first-order effects, and those are, as I already mentioned, on some of these entities or countries that are obviously they're imposing sanctions or that are impacted by what's going on because of their vicinity to it. Ultimately also what the impact is on Ukraine and Russia in the long run, but also the second order effects. What does this mean in terms of the ability of international organizations, in terms of the kind of multilateral regimes to respond to acts of brazen aggression, of breaches of sovereignty? What does this mean in terms of the future course of globalization when it comes to trade, or when it comes to the free flow of information via internet, as we see basically a kind of decoupling and kind of splitting of internet? What does this mean in terms of the shifting priorities in order to address some of the biggest and kind of chronic problems that the world is facing, such as climate change and similar? we are only in the early stages. And again, I would just go back to that first remark, and that is that we are in a position to probably ask way more questions than we are to provide answers. But I do look forward to exchanging thoughts over the course of the next 40 minutes or so.
Thank you, Gorana. And you touched on a lot of topics we do want to cover today. Sanctions, what this means for the Biden administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific, some of the information warfare that's going on. But why don't we start with sanctions? Stephen, this approach to sanctions, where the US has led on a lot of things in a way they haven't before, it's been described as weapons of mass economic destruction. Do you agree with that assessment? And do you think there'll be enough to deter Putin?
Answer the second part of the question first, Murray. No, the sanctions will not deter Putin. He is not looking for an off-ramp. He's made it very clear he intends to see what he calls this military operation, special military operation through, and he won't stop until he's destroyed the Ukrainian government in Kyiv, perhaps killing the Ukrainian first family, as President Zelensky has said. So I don't think deterrence is going to be based on sanctions in terms of the Ukrainian war. It will slow Putin down considerably when the sanctions bite. And the United States and the Nato countries, the EU countries for that matter, have another card to play here. This will be very painful for Western Europe, not so painful for North America, which is one of the reasons the Canadians are out in front here, and that is to ban imports of Russian oil and gas. That would have an enormous impact upon the Russian economy beyond what's already been achieved, with the sanctions coming down on the Russian central bank, which effectively freezes over $600 billion of assets on the major Russian banks, and then extending through the oligarchy and so on and so forth. You have a situation in which the sanctions can bite and can demonstrate to all and sundry just how effectively they can cripple an economy. And there are people watching this elsewhere who will watch the impact of the sanctions very carefully. Now, China can assist Russia in a number of circumstances. We've seen with wheat sales and with contracts in oil and gas and things of that nature. That's already occurred. And we've seen that the Chinese have made it clear that Putin could strip his Far Eastern defences of troops and send them to the Ukrainian front without having to worry about the Russian strategic back. That's already occurred. But I doubt that China wants to carry Russia in this fight in the long term. And if the West is prepared to apply sanctions in the longer term and to increase the pressure in that area I've just mentioned, oil and gas, then it does have a very serious impact upon an aggressor. And that's where I think their value happens to lie.
And you mentioned, the oil and gas embargoes. Gorana, you're an expert in US politics, and you're also in Europe at the moment. Do you have any takes in terms of what that might do to the political sentiment, which is a major focus of the Biden administration heading into the midterms, or how that might be viewed in Europe as well in terms of making that move to the full embargo of oil and gas from Russia?
Yes, so the question of sanctions of Russian hydrocarbons exports is an interesting one from both that perspective of political economy, but also from the perspective of economic warfare actually being kind of an extension of the kinetic warfare that we are seeing, or a substitute basically for the fact that NATO allies, the transatlantic partners in general, have basically drawn a clear line as to how much involvement they would have, right, ruling out sending troops on the ground or imposing a no-fly zone. So in terms of these sanctions, which some are saying are basically a matter of when, not if, we can distinguish between oil and gas. And it's important to make that that distinction because in the context of who gets to hurt more, it seems that if the West collectively goes after Russia's oil but not gas, this could have a greater impact on Russia's coffers rather than imposing it on Russia's gas exports, simply because of the kind of very banal fact of Europe still being quite dependent on Russia's gas. Now, the problem with sanctions on hydrocarbons in general is one where we are talking about an environment which is already an environment of high inflation on both sides of the Atlantic. So any sort of sanctions on the exports of Russian energy will inevitably push the prices up, which means that they will translate obviously into higher costs for the end consumers. And obviously, as you mentioned, Mari, we are talking about a year when the US will be seeing the midterm elections in November of this year, when already, I said that there has been a bit of bipartisanship on display in US Congress when it came to standing up against Russia. But at the same time, we have to understand that a lot of these domestic political battles will be waged on basically painting President Biden as either an unsuccessful or a weak president, one that isn't able to respond to some of these economic challenges. And certainly there are calculations around that. So this is something that the administration, Biden administration especially, will have to weigh out. Obviously, to substitute Russia's energy, this is not going to happen overnight. We are already seeing talks also about how we could see other alternatives coming up. So one thing to also bring into conversation is the negotiations around the new Iran deal after obviously US withdrawal from JCPOA under the Trump administration, and how actually Iran could get into this mix, or the Biden administration courting Saudis to try to get more oil onto the market, or even some, kind of now pie in the skies with Venezuela and similar. But again, to come back to that very the kind of first order question, and that is one, how do you actually calibrate sanctions in a way that they do impose costs and that they do induce a behavior change? I would agree with Stephen that this will be more like an economic war of attrition rather than something that could happen overnight. But at the same time, how do you do it in a way that you don't end up shooting yourself in the foot? And again, Europe is in a way worse of a position in that sense than the US, for instance, on the whole.
Yeah, and the embargo of oil and gas was one of several pleas that have come from Ukraine recently. Over the weekend, there was an op-ed written by longtime aide to President Zelensky, and they talked about, wanting to have that full embargo on all Russian oil and exports. He talked about wanting, anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons and ammunition, which might have some support in the US. Having a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which Putin has responded that he'll treat that as an involvement from an external party. And that does not seem to be getting any traction in the US. Ban on all Russian banks from the SWIFT banking system rather than a select few. And he called on the Budapest memorandum for the UN Security Council to provide assistance to the Ukraine. And he says, even though Russia vetoed the measure, other members of the Security Council should uphold this. On the flip side, and while the US is grappling with which of these things would they be willing to do, and NATO and other allied partners, which would they maybe do, which wouldn't they do, Putin has come out now with his kind of list of demands, or Russia's demands, where they say, they'll stop at a moment if these demands are met, they'll stop at a moment with this conflict in Ukraine. They want Ukraine to recognize the breakaway regions of Donetsk and Lugansk, the loss of Crimea, and then establishing itself as neutral in relation to NATO and other alliances. Really, for either of you, do you think these kind of amputations are necessary and would stop the bleeding and would lead to a stop of the conflict in Ukraine and is the best way forward? Or would it really just be appeasement and the tip of the iceberg for Russia?
You would need to be very naive to accept Putin's suggested end to the war, Murray. The Minsk Accords provide for Luhansk and Donetsk, and Gorana, correct me if I'm wrong here, to remain part of Ukraine and to be represented in the Ukrainian parliament, for example. And you cannot have a situation in international relations where the neighbour hives off a piece of another state, claims it, and then wants it formalised in an agreement. Simply won't work. What's to stop Putin moving again on Georgia, moving on Moldova, and so on, or other non-NATO countries in the arena? That is appeasement. I cannot see the Ukrainians agreeing to that. They've put up too fierce and independent resistance in support of their sovereignty, to defend their sovereignty. To agree to something like that, it does show that Putin has now realised he doesn't have the army that he thought he had. This is not the first time in Russian history that this has happened. Look back to the Winter War in Finland in 1939. Stalin had to come to exactly the same conclusion. So Putin offers an olive branch which is poisoned, knows it will not be accepted. Then he can move to a much more violent effort, simply destroying opposition from the air, as I said, as he's done in Grozny, as he's done in Aleppo and Homs and elsewhere. And I think that what's that about? I don't think that's a reasonable basis for a settlement that's been offered. And
if we turn our minds to the kind of nuclear threat we're facing at the moment, in the Cold War, the buildup of nuclear weapons, the concept was to get them to a point where either, Russia could be destroyed or the US could be destroyed many times over. That was predicated on this, as Stephen, you mentioned in your opening remarks, deterrence due to assured mutual destruction. But now Putin seems to be cavalierly threatening nuclear force by announcing that he is making his nuclear triad combat ready. And over the weekend, we saw, the capture of some of the nuclear power bases in Ukraine. It feels like this word is coming up over and over, and we're at a level we haven't seen for a long time. When was the last time that we were at this heightened state of nuclear readiness? And how can the US and other nuclear powers respond?
Do you want me to take a run at that, Murray?
Yeah, go for it, Gorana.
Well, very briefly, I'd like to hear Gorana's view. We came very close to a nuclear confrontation during the Reagan administration in those years, 1983 through 1985, where Soviet paranoia had taken hold in the Kremlin to a more pronounced degree than usual. And the Soviets became convinced that NATO was about to launch a first strike against the USSR. And it got to the point where you had Warsaw Pact aircraft in the German Democratic Republic in East Germany being equipped with tactical nuclear missiles to respond to an attack that they thought was coming from the US and the other Western nuclear powers. This was an appalling fabrication in imagination. Ronald Reagan actually had to call the Soviet ambassador into the Oval Office and to state bluntly that the West had absolutely no plans, no intention of attacking the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact at all. And people could stand down, and that diffused the crisis. So we came close in those years. What's changed is that Russian military doctrine, this in the words of the chairman of their chiefs of staff, Valery Gerasimov, whom you see in those television footages of Putin and the other military leaders. Gerasimov has had the opinion that it's possible to use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield without provoking an overall nuclear war. This is an absolute nonsense. And the doctrine holds, well, if it's a non-NATO power or a NATO non-nuclear power, the Russians can use tactical nuclear weapons and there won't be a blowback. Well, the point is, whenever that's been war gamed, the blowback has been massive, and it leads to a general nuclear exchange and a global nuclear war. But the Russians hold to this. So when Putin rattles the nuclear silo, he's talking in a different language to that which Brezhnev and Andropov used to talk. So it is very dangerous and has to be regarded very seriously.
Gorana, last year in one of the webinars as part of your NATO Experts Talk series, there was a focus on NATO's role toward disarmament and how they try to de-escalate a lot of these tensions as part of the alliance. I guess from a NATO perspective, how are these nuclear threats viewed? Because Ukraine is not technically part of NATO at the moment, but how do they respond to those kinds of threats happening in Europe?
So there are a couple of things there. First of all, we can't overstate the potential, the impact that obviously any sort of a mishap or further escalation around, capture of some of these nuclear power plants could have on not just security in Ukraine, but also Europe and then more broadly, if anything was to happen of the scale, that we saw in Chernobyl now nearly 36 years ago. So in that sense, what was going on just a couple of days around Zaporizhia, the nuclear power plant, was pretty scary, to say the least. But I would say this has the whole question of nuclear armament has also put into forefront the pledge that President Biden made around changing US's stance on the use of nuclear weapons, and this debate that we've seen actually go on in Washington around sole use and no first use pledge and so on, and basically what this is going to mean in the context of US's nuclear posture review that we should see over the soon coming up, that is. So in that sense, around the kind of two sides of the coin, one being nuclear weapons or nuclear armament as a deterrent, and then the other one, the need to actually be engaged in conversations around strategic stability, around reduction, around limits to nuclear armament. This is made all the harder, obviously, with what's going on. So we know that last year when President Biden and Vladimir Putin met in Geneva, they were talking about the need to engage in these talks around arms control, for instance. But given what's going on in Ukraine, some of these things will inevitably be shelved or deprioritized for the time being, or just basically, given the lines of communication are now at the level of just basic kind of agreement around deconfliction mechanisms, isn't leaving a lot of space for some of these deeper strategic talks to happen. So in that sense, the kind of agenda on arms control, for instance, on non-proliferation, is one that certainly will stand to lose given what's going on in Ukraine at the moment.
And I'll go to one more question before we go over to answering some of the audience questions. This one really is for either of you, but we're seeing the use of both information and disinformation on a lot of levels at different aspects of this conflict. We've seen the Biden administration's approach to deterrence by disclosure, sharing kind of this is what's going to happen and pre-gaming that. And then so far, it seems like everything they've said is going to happen has happened. We've seen President Zelensky, taking to the streets, doing posts from social media, winning hearts and minds to now a point where there's discussions about, oh, who's going to play him in the movie about this one day. And then we've seen, on the Russian front, not just their own, propaganda and disinformation, but changing of their legislation targeting fake news to a point where now most of the major media outlets have withdrawn from Russia over concerns about going to jail of their independent coverage. So I guess my question for either of you is, how effective have these information tactics been, and what are the impacts that we can see as a result of this?
So on the deterrence by disclosure, which was basically a kind of a more novel tactic that US tried along with allies to essentially deny Vladimir Putin this sort of element of surprise. I would say that obviously it's been quite mixed, and I think it's more about the fact that what majority of us probably weren't expecting was actually a kind of conventional war of this scale in Ukraine at all. And so in that sense, in terms of the potential kind of forecasting of scenarios and kind of, just letting it kind of, or portraying it out there, it was tried as an element that might actually stall the invasion and kind of prolong the period of these negotiations, but clearly it didn't necessarily sway Putin. What I would say in terms of the kind of general information warfare, Vladimir Putin's ability to control the kind of messaging out of Kremlin, to enlist allies in the West, has been severely impacted by what's going on in Ukraine. And I think that what we've seen over the past 2-3 weeks now is the fact that some of those that have maybe in Europe been on the fence or even openly expressed admiration for Putin and his regime have now been essentially forced to either to kind of switch sides or to at least not appear in public with those views. And so in that sense, Putin's ability to engage in that kind of the extent to which he engaged in information warfare has changed drastically. And that's also owing to the images and the messages that are coming out of Ukraine. So Putin's brand is toxic, and you're absolutely right that in terms of the way that Ukraine is portrayed, Ukrainian people, their leadership, it's certainly in that kind of global competition, if you wish, for winning hearts and minds of the globe, it's resoundingly on the Ukrainian side. And this is something that we've seen as well in, just recently the UN General Assembly's resolution, where over 2/3 of the UNGA voted in support of Ukraine and similar. So in that sense, it's quite clear where things are going. But at the same time, we should not also underestimate Putin, and also the fact that he is not without allies. And I'm sure we'll get to those questions around China in a little bit.
Great, thank you. Now for the first audience question, Stephen, I was hoping you could answer this, but will what's happening now, will it increase or decrease the likelihood of China invading Taiwan, which is something you talked about a little bit earlier as well, in terms of what this means for Asia and other events unfolding?
Well, Beijing is at a crossroads too in terms of its no limitations agreement with Putin, which already seems to be quite constricted. Does Xi Jinping wish to play the statesman's role here globally and help settle the conflict? Does China want to stay with Russia throughout this conflict, be supportive and inevitably be grouped with the Kremlin as another dictatorship which is sympathetic to aggression? There's no question in my mind that two situations, Taiwan and the Ukraine, are not analogous. There are similarities. There's no question about that. But in terms of China's designs on Taiwan, it's got a number of other factors to take into its assessment. There is a treaty relationship under the Taiwan Relations Act between the US and Taiwan, and while it's not explicit that the US would come to Taiwan's assistance, it is assumed in Washington that that's the case. And there's a convergence in the US Congress on China, which very much moves across the aisle from the left of the Democratic Party to the right of the Republican Party, that it's at least China is a strategic adversary. The Chinese also have to take into account the response of other US allies, particularly the Japanese, if they endeavour to take Taiwan militarily. And the response of much of the globe, including in the UN General Assembly, to which Gorana just made reference, will have not been ignored in Beijing in terms of the impact upon its interests if it began a conflict. The Chinese don't want to worsen their relations with the Americans. They certainly don't want to alienate European opinion. They have substantial economic, trade and investment interests in Europe, including in Ukraine, by the way, where Ukrainian corn is important to their agriculture for a start. So there are all these calculations that must be made in Beijing. If I had to offer an opinion, I say it makes a conflict in the Taiwan Straits less likely. Can you rule it out? No, of course not. But I think it becomes less likely given what's happened in Ukraine.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Gorana.
And maybe just to add to that, I agree with Stephen. I would just say that we have to distinguish between the impact that 2014 annexation of Crimea had on Xi's thinking versus what is going on at the moment. And certainly the 2014 and the kind of lower intensity conflict that was going on in Ukraine made China probably much more sympathetic, I would say, to the kind of tactics that were employed by Putin. But at this point, we have seen China kind of trying to balance. I wouldn't say that much has changed in terms of the strategic assessments on part of either, obviously, Russia and China, where they see each other moving forward. China obviously would have preferred more stability and kind of predictability in terms of the way that international affairs are conducted, but this also gives China the ability to maybe not be in the spotlight as much. I do agree with Stephen that seeing the united front on part of the allies is something that could act as a deterrent. But equally, this sort of now the opportunity for Russia and China to come closer together is something, again, that shouldn't be underestimated moving forward. In that sense, also one final thing, and that goes to that kind of humility around assessments. We are talking about different theaters as well. And, the Indo-Pacific is obviously a theater which is primarily a maritime space, as opposed to the kind of landmass that we are talking about in Europe, and the type of warfare we would see, again, the engagement of some of these emerging and disruptive technologies as well, in the context of China and Taiwan, are all the kind of things that also need to be factored in these calculations. But certainly we haven't seen as resounding of a support from China at this point that probably Vladimir Putin would have hoped for. But equally, I wouldn't say that the hopes to enlist China as a mediator in this conflict, or as someone that could help stop Vladimir Putin, are all that warranted, or that they could materialize anytime soon.
We've received a couple of questions that kind of touch on how does this conflict influence the relationship between Russia and other countries, as well as other alliances outside of NATO and Europe. But yeah, noting Russia's recent rekindling of closer ties with Laos, Myanmar, large-scale investment in Indonesia's tourism sector, including Bali. It's a lot of things growing and changing, shifting in the Indo-Pacific. Could this signal an added strategic dimension for Australian and Western interests across ASEAN? And will it need to recalibrate in the near future in the aftermath of the Ukraine-Russia conflict? And this also ties in, I think, with something we talked about a little bit earlier about, the just released Biden Indo-Pacific strategy. Does that need a recalibration as a result of these developments?
Strategically, there'll need to be a good deal of recalibration, not only insofar as NATO is concerned, but US allies elsewhere. The Russian challenge is nowhere near as serious or as significant as the challenge from Beijing in the South Pacific and amongst the countries of ASEAN. So while it has to be factored into our thinking, it's not a priority at the moment, nor will it become a priority. A lot of states are very wary in the wake of the sanctions regime imposed by the West upon Russia of doing business with Russia. And certainly investment will largely dry up in the Russian economy from places around the world. And there are a lot of companies already. We've seen the oil companies withdrawing, for example. We've seen Visa and MasterCard leaving. We have a circumstance in which companies are very wary of being caught in the sanctions net or being fined massively for being seen to do business with those who do business with Russian companies. So I don't think a Russian economic challenge is a serious challenge in our region of the world. I think the challenge from China far more significant and will continue to be.
Yeah, so in the context, and just to add 2 cents to this, in this context of heightened competition and rivalry between the West more broadly and Russia, it will be much harder for certain states that wanted to be kind of third wayers or non-aligned in a sense of kind of 21st century politics to remain so, because of what Stephen mentioned, potential impacts, the kind of secondary sanctions and similar. So obviously we are seeing corporations already factoring this in, limiting exposure to the potential reach of the sanctions. But again, it seems that the ability of certain states to try to practice that kind of pluralized diplomacy is being increasingly narrowed. So some countries, for instance, to take a look at, India, for instance, or Israel, their politics, where they have tried to be aligned with or have been increasingly aligned with the West, but then at the same time try to have good relations with Russia, are probably going to be put to at least a question moving forward, if not re-examined.
Thank you. And depending on time, this might be our last question. We'll see. I think this is something on a lot of people's minds, but do you believe that this conflict can lead to a level similar to the Second World War, or can it be resolved before we reach that point? What are your thoughts and reactions?
We need to be very careful, and to date NATO is being very careful to avoid the kind of incident that can lead to a full-blown war between the NATO alliance and Russia. Is it possible to say whether or not that kind of flashpoint incident can be avoided? No, but certainly the Western powers are doing all within reason to avoid that. There's an element in here which should be mentioned, Murray, and that's the bravery of the Russian opposition, the extraordinary courage that ordinary Russians show going into the streets of cities across the country to demonstrate against Putin. And we should do all within the law and within reason to be supportive. And people asked earlier about cyber. The work of Anonymous has been very good, hacking into Russian television channels to play footage of what is actually going on in Ukraine, showing that there is a war, for example. And I think that's going to become increasingly significant in terms of not so much the balance of power, but the balance of opinion. There are already reports of some Russian Orthodox priests speaking out in their churches against the war. Now, Putin enjoys the support of Archbishop Kirill, the primate in Moscow, but it doesn't mean he enjoys the support of the entire church. And I think these elements have to be taken into consideration. The ordinary Russians are going to suffer grievously under these sanctions. And the more we can be supportive of them, marvellous people, marvellous, warm and welcoming people, had the privilege of travelling in their country a number of occasions. The more we can be supportive is not only the right thing to do, but it has an impact in terms of the overall Russian perspective on the future in Europe and elsewhere.
Thanks. I think one last question I'd love to hear from both of you quickly, if we could. And I think, again, this is on everyone's mind, but how can the war end? Will it be something like occupation of a devastated Ukraine with guerrilla warfare? So what do you see as how is this gaming out? How does the war end? Maybe, Gorana, can we come to you first?
Yes, so there are a lot of different kind of paths from here. First of all, to, if we go down the route of some sort of negotiated settlement, what would it take actually to get both sides to credibly commit to some sort of settlement, to get to the table in a credible way, is some form of mutually hurting stalemate. And we hope that that one doesn't come with a lot more blood spilled. And what that could mean, in terms of how Ukraine looks in the future, whether it's basically, Ukraine without the East, without parts of the South, or whether it's Ukraine that would be under some sort of federal arrangements, as Stephen was already talking about in terms of the kind of context of Minsk II and so on. I don't think that it's very likely that we are going to see that kind of power sharing in the most optimistic sense happen anytime soon. But, I would like to remain hopeful. But then in terms of, Ukraine moving forward, Is this a country that is going to be Finlandized, or is it going to be Israelized? And what I mean by this is whether, or is it going to be absorbed somehow within the Euro-Atlantic integration? So there is already a lot of talk, and I'm going to wrap up here, a lot of talk about, again, Russia winning militarily, but being unable to do it politically. So if that's the case, what are the prospects of some of these scenarios materializing? We simply don't know at this point, again, being now in the 12th day of the invasion. But again, those scenarios are all plausible to an extent and should be given consideration.
Thanks. And we're at time, but Stephen, I do want to hear just quickly from you in terms of how do you think this ends?
As briefly as I can be, Murray, Ukraine's made a determination. They wish to be European, like the Georgians, like the Baltic states. So they'll stay on that course. The Russians can win every battle and lose the war, as Gorana intimated. Worst possible scenario, puppet Russian government in Kyiv, a government of Ukraine that's recognised widely, that's in exile in Poland or somewhere else in the West, and a long-term insurgency. That, I think, unfortunately, is the most probable result. The Russian military can prevail on the battlefield, but they cannot prevail internationally, and ultimately, the invasion will fail.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today, sharing your thoughts and your insights on the situation unfolding in Ukraine. Thank you very much to everyone who's joined this webinar. We appreciate you joining us. If you liked what you heard today, we'd encourage you to come to future webinars as well. Make sure that you subscribe for our invitations. And our next special event will actually be next week on Wednesday, the 16th of March. We'll be live streaming the launch of our annual publication, The State of the United States. And we'll be live streaming that on Zoom. So if you go to our website, you can register and get all the details so you don't miss out on that major event. We'll be featuring Defense Minister Dutton, Shadow Foreign Minister Wong, and Shadow Defense Minister O'Connor, as well as US Representative Joe Courtney at the event. So we're very much looking forward to it and hope that you can tune in to hear that special event and launch of our report. Thank you very much. Bye.